Today, I'd like to talk about, as Jing has said, language assessment literacy 2.0, or the question whether, in light of these technological developments, we need a different conceptualization of language assessment literacy, and what some of the challenges and some of the opportunities might be that come associated with that. So a quick overview of my talk. I'm going to quickly talk about, or briefly talk about, the status quo, where we are with our conceptualizations, and how we got here. I'll talk a little bit about the relation of, or this idea of technology in high stakes versus low stakes or lower stakes assessment contexts. And then I'll try to illustrate with some issues and challenges why I think this is a hot topic at the moment, as Jing has said. And I'll try to conclude with some suggestions on possible ways forward, to then also open up the discussion to hear what other suggestions might be. So in keeping with the terminology of the digital age and computer terminology, I think the beta version of definitions of assessment literacy were very much definitions of assessment literacy and less so of language assessment literacy. The definition we find at the early 90s by Rick Stiggins, for instance, is very vague to some extent as the knowledge assessors need to possess. And in 2001, when Brindley really kickstarted the discussion about language assessment literacy, so to speak, he wrote that although there's been a considerable amount of research in general education into teachers' assessment practices, levels and training and professional development needs, there have been relatively few investigations of these questions in the context of language teaching programs. And I think with language assessment literacy 1.0, if you will, sort of as of the 2000s, as we're starting to explore this topic more systematically. I mean, now it's probably one of the hot topics in language assessment, and I think rightly so. But as we were moving towards that, there are two components that I think are critical there. And one of them is that there seems to be more and more a recognition of language and sort of the construct of language playing a role. So you can see this in the definition provided by Pill and Harding in their 2013 paper. But also it's, and what's I think important for the talk of today, this idea that with this knowledge and skills base, there comes the ability, or should come the ability, of a critical evaluation or a critical understanding of language assessment practices and the roles and functions of these assessments within society. So definition by Kieran O'Loughlin, for instance, points this out, and also Vogt and Zagari in 2014. It's this critical evaluation component of tests and other assessment procedures. And I think that's quite important to what I'll be talking about today, because maybe through technological advances, there are different affordances so that we can critically evaluate these assessments in a literate way. The question then is, do we need an LAL 2.0, and what would that look like? So given the digital age, do our conceptualizations of LAL sufficiently reflect technology awareness, particularly in relation to this critical evaluation ability, or is there something missing? Now, if we look at some of the more recent conceptualizations, and I've picked out two for the purpose of this presentation, then we find that they don't really pay that much tribute or acknowledge the role of technology at this point. So both of the ones that I've chosen are heavily influenced and inspired by the seminal paper by Linda Taylor from the 2013 language testing special issue, in which she illustrated a way of thinking about language assessment literacy. And you can see here in the work that's Baker and Riches have done, or in what came out of the work that Baker and Riches did with more than 100 teachers in Haiti, that these components that we have here don't really reflect any specific concerns for technology. So they might touch on them here or there, but essentially we have theoretical and conceptual knowledge, task performance, language pedagogy, collaboration. I'll get back to that later. Awareness of local practices, awareness of personal beliefs and attitudes, and decision making. But there's no explicit reference here in this conceptualization of assessment literacy or language assessment literacy to technology and what challenges might come with it. Another example is coming out of work that I've done with my colleague Luke Harding from Lancaster University. This was a large-scale survey with more than 1,000 stakeholders from all over the world. And again, we see these components here, but there's no explicit reference. And I did, in preparation for this talk, go back to all of the 71 statements that we had used in the survey and thought would sort of cover a range or most of aspects of assessment literacy or language assessment literacy. But there's no explicit reference in any of these 71 statements that we used in our survey to technology. So clearly, there's currently only an implicit technology awareness in our conceptualizations of LAL, and it doesn't stop at these conceptualizations. This is also reflected in some of our association's guidelines. So for instance, the ILTA guidelines for practice, which are being revised only now, and I know this because I'm a member of that task force. Only now we're trying to bring in a more explicit reference to computer-delivered assessment and the role of technology in assessment. Now, you might ask, why might that be an issue, or is it an issue at all? Well, the fact of the matter is that, as Schmidt-Gall and Powers noted in their 2017 paper, that technology has been having a huge impact on testing. It's had an impact on how tests are developed, with things like the way, or aspects like the way we generate our items, the way we can display them, what formats we have, what limitations to formats we have. It's been having a huge impact on how tests are administered, computer-based, computer-adaptive delivery even. The scoring as well has been impacted. So thinking about automated scoring, automated feedback, as we've already touched on briefly today. It's also been having a huge impact on how tests are monitored. So there's a range of security issues that come along with this technology advancements, on-site monitoring, online proctoring, post hoc authentication, malpractice detection. All of these things there are different dimensions to it now with new technology. And a point that's not in their paper, but that Luke Harding added in his 2018 eCult keynote on ethics and innovation in language assessment, which I do highly recommend that you go and watch online. The component of validation, technology has opened up a whole new area of how we can validate our tests. So if you think about eye tracking, that seems to be, methodology-wise, in recent years, seems to be one of the flavors of the month, really. Other technologies like keystroke logging, EEG, but also technologies that we might not even consider that new anymore, like corpus analysis. So all of these are new ways, new avenues that have been opened up and that have been impacted to various degrees, or to a large degree, I would argue, and Schmickal and Powers argue, by technology. Schmickal and Powers in their paper talk about three specific areas, and I picked out this sort of screenshot from their paper because I think that particularly when it comes to these challenges, and particularly these two challenges that I've highlighted here, it's really here where we need language assessment literacy. So questions about narrowing constructs of measurement or use of devices that facilitate cheating. Those are really the challenges where we need language assessment literacy to participate in that critical evaluation that I mentioned of what's going on. However, those that are familiar with the paper will notice, and the keen observers might also have noticed this, Schmickal and Power talk about all of these aspects, and if you look at them in more detail, they are all predominantly aspects that relate to high stakes testing. And they acknowledge this fair and square and say technology is used in both high and low stakes testing, but may be particularly beneficial for high stakes tests that need to accommodate large test taker populations with standardized administrations. Now, that's all well and good, but it does sort of leave us with the question, what does that mean for low stakes or lower stakes assessment? Does it mean that there's no less technology in assessment used? Well, yes, maybe, but needed? Not so sure. Does it mean that there's no or fewer serious challenges when it comes to implementing that technology? Does it mean that there's no or less language assessment literacy needed? Or does it mean that there's no or less technological awareness in language assessment literacy needed? And this is particularly interesting, I think, because on a daily basis, I would argue the majority of assessment that's happening every day in particularly classrooms all over the world is perhaps low stakes. So we're talking actually about a much larger scale that's sort of problematic, because it seems to trail behind both in implementation and in the attention that it's getting from research. Now, it's even more of a problem because I think I would agree with Tannenbaum and Kane, who say that high stakes and low stakes is far beyond a simple dichotomy, and the implication of the denomination low stakes, that it's somewhat associated with less need of or a need for meeting lower standards of quality, for instance. I don't think that quite holds. So as I said, it might even be more problematic because we're lagging behind in this engagement with tech and language assessment. At least that's my observation from the context that I work in Austria, that in fact it is probably fair to say that technology has not quite trickled down into low stakes and classroom-based assessment the way it's been pursued in high stakes testing. And that might have a lot to do with the resources available, but I think that is an issue that we need to address. Now, I think it'd be wrong to assume that there's no tech being used in some areas of lower stakes assessment. Think about the widespread use of plagiarism software, for instance, in certain, perhaps predominantly EAP contexts. But yes, it didn't have or hasn't had the same resources for implementation, and it hasn't had the same attention from testing researchers. So there's still a lot to explore. And as I said, I thought this was sort of mainly the reality of Austrian classrooms maybe, but ironically, the very reason why I am now speaking to you only virtually and only now as opposed to in March, has provided even more evidence to support this argument. Because there was, of course, the COVID pandemic that has brought to light some of these challenges even more. So just sort of looking around on Twitter over the last couple of months, where you find comments like this: "You telling me that my professor who can't stop the YouTube autoplayer from playing the next video is going to teach classes online? Well, this should be good." Or the fact that we've experienced a kind of panic goji, as this NPR article calls it. And there wasn't a very smooth transition to the online or remote learning and teaching, let alone assessment. Did sort of hammer home to me that we have quite a way to go, and that it's all well and good talking about these things and the language assessment literacy related to technology in high stakes exams, but maybe it's a different situation for classroom exams and lower stakes exams. And the number of retweets and likes, for instance, on some of these comments does indicate to me that there is a degree of agreement and maybe similar experiences from people all around the world. And then on a similar note, you also find comments like this: "Found a kid playing with her dog instead of Zooming with her teacher. She told me not to worry. She took a screenshot of herself paying attention, then cut her video and replaced it with the picture. It's a gallery view of 20 kids, Mom. They can't tell. She is 10. Or this one: "I found my third grader doing her writing spelling assignment on her school iPad by dictating the whole thing. I'm not sure virtual learning is working out when kids are so good with technology." So I do think that COVID has highlighted a number of issues here. One is that there seems to be still, particularly in lower stakes contexts, a lack of digital literacy in the first place, let alone talk of digital language assessment literacy. So does that mean we're trying to run before we can walk? And in some of these low stakes scenarios, as the last two images have indicated, we should probably be just as worried about the digital literacy of teachers and administrators in comparison to the digital literacy of the test takers, and maybe one generation without, I'm not trying to be ageist here or anything, but one generation may be overtaking the other. And this is interesting because Schmidt-Gall and Powers, for instance, in their paper, voiced concerns regarding the digital literacy of test takers when it comes to high stakes tests. And I think maybe in low stakes scenarios, we might have a slightly different situation. And so the one question that presents itself to me here is, okay, if we're talking about the basics in terms of digital literacy lacking, how can we move into digital language assessment literacy? Another thing is, of course, this lack of resources for digital or online assessment. And this became evident to me because we saw how even high stakes testing organizations were partly struggling to pivot quickly to online testing. And these are companies or nonprofit organizations that have a lot more resources than the average language teacher or EAP department, and so on and so forth. But it's also highlighted, I think, that nonetheless technology in assessment may be here to stay, and that's by no means a novel observation, of course, but I do think that came across quite clearly over the last couple of months. And of course, or I think that maybe in these low stakes scenarios, yes, we do need the digital literacy as the basis first, but there's no reason why this digital language assessment literacy could not develop alongside it in parallel. So as a consequence, I think, and I would again agree with Luke Harding here, we need to combine LAL with a technology awareness for both high stakes and low stakes assessment scenarios and stakeholders, as is also highlighted by this very conference's theme. And why do we need that? Some examples maybe. Chappell and Douglas already argued in 2006 that language ability itself may need to be defined in terms of an interaction between language and technology. And so there's interesting questions that touching on language assessment literacy that come up with that. So one of the questions that me and my team in Innsbruck have been thinking about quite recently is, what is authentic language assessment or authentic language in today's world or in the future? Does a robust definition of reading these days need to include the ability to gather information from the internet as well as traditional print sources and synthesize information? So the very fact that technology has changed the nature of communication, of language, and therefore our constructs, how good a job are we as a field currently doing in capturing that, both in high and low stakes assessment? Another question related to that is this danger of narrowing constructs because of technology in assessment that I already touched upon earlier. So questions about automated scoring. Are we in danger of going for what's computationally easier or doable? Because that might not be the best representation of a communicative task, and we might actually be at risk of turning back the clocks to pre-communicative testing in a way by narrowing constructs to what's easily reproducible, administrable, and scorable by machines. Other examples that, for instance, Harding mentions in his talk are automated pronunciation assessment, which is sort of a similar avenue. And there've also been criticisms of tests such as Duolingo or Versant by Pearson in recent years for partly perhaps doing that. I do, however, want to acknowledge at this point that these automated systems do have a lot of advantages for us as well, and that there are immense opportunities that developers, for instance, at these institutions have uncovered or still are uncovering for us. It's maybe just a matter of harnessing them. And here's where I think we might need a technology-aware language assessment literacy to mediate between, as Harding calls it, the technological innovation and the conceptual innovation. Because in general, as technology-related issues of language assessment will continue to increase in their detail and complexity, the need will continue to grow for professionals capable of negotiating the many considerations that come into play in the design of computer-assisted language tests. So I would fully agree with Chappell and Voss here, or as they say in a later publication, it's particularly also this area of investigating consequences of testing. That's really interesting, and that's where we're again at this point of critical ability to critically evaluate. So the question then is, how do we get there? And here comes the big anticlimax. I don't know. But I do see at least two opportunities for ways forward. And those two are A, transparency, and B, collaborations. And this is again sort of linking up nicely with Beverly's publication. I do think both of these are facilitated incredibly by the technology that we have today. Transparency, I think, will help us through engaging with initiatives like open science principles, and it's great to see journals like Language Testing engaging with these things more and more. Because in some ways it's never been easier to share ideas and findings and to reach out, and that would help us overcome this issue of sometimes being very little supporting evidence for how, for instance, scoring algorithms work. and overcome this idea of all of it to do with technology just being a black box. And collaboration, I think, is probably even more key, because there is little chance that one person will be able to do and know it all. So I think it's really through collaboration, through multidisciplinary collaboration, that we can get to the bottom of this. And again, through technology, we have better ways than ever to communicate with each other globally and also across stakeholder groups. And so I do think, again, coming back to this talk or this idea by Luc from 2018, that there is this new space to some extent, that we have, on the one hand, the expertise or the technology literacy, often found in people listed here, computational linguists, computer scientists, speech scientists, security specialists, and so on and so forth. And we have people who maybe have a bit more language assessment literacy, but less of the technology literacy, people like test developers, validation researchers, etc. And I do think that this collaboration will be helpful in addressing these challenges that technology in assessment or in language assessment presents us with. And to expand on this idea by Luc, I think we need to bring in even more groups into this shared space. Pedagogy experts, for instance, relating specifically to tech, language teachers, or experts on what 21st century skills are, SLA researchers or other language researchers who are specialists on what communication or language looks like in the digital age, test takers and test users. And I know ideally in a Venn diagram we would see one area where all of these overlap, of course, but I think you get the idea that this is one way forward for me. Because looking ahead, coming back again to this initial question, do we need a new definition of language assessment literacy that incorporates this? Do we need a new definition of LAL 2.0? Well, I'm not so sure. I don't necessarily think so, but I do think that we certainly need to move into that shared space. And as I said, not just with tech experts who we traditionally think of, but also with experts on other or from other areas that investigate or have experience and expertise with the impact of technology. So for instance, as I said, how tech has changed communication, language, and constructs in general. And this, of course, means or might mean also adjusting our jargon and language. And this is something that, for instance, Linda has just recently pointed out again in the ILTA Language Assessment Literacy SIG reading group meeting that was held just a couple of days ago, because it needs to then be a shared space where both sides kind of move towards each other. And particularly, I think this maybe more language assessment literate community of assessment experts needs to support and engage with those involved in low stakes assessment contexts in future proofing our assessments. And again, creating this shared space where there's their expertise coming in and also the expertise of the language assessment specialists is coming in. Because I do think the implementation and discussion about this has now been jump-started or catapulted forward immensely by COVID. So through exploring ways of increased transparency and collaboration, I think we should be keeping it moving forward. So at this point, I'd like to stop and just quickly thank my LAL collaborator, Luc Harding, who's the person that I've been discussing these things with and the person who has influenced my thinking about this probably the most in recent years. And I'd like to thank you for your attention. If there's any questions, comments, ideas, then I'd be happy to react to them. Thank you very much.